In tonight's video, we're diving into 7 spine-chilling ghost stories, all pulled from the eerie front lines of healthcare. These tales come directly from nurses who've had their worlds turned upside down by the unexplainable, all while caring for their patients. From shadowy figures lurking in hospital hallways to ghostly apparitions in patient rooms, these encounters will leave you questioning what truly happens when the lights go out. Prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown, where the line between life and death begins to blur, and the spirits of the past may still haunt the living. Story #1. The Little Fingers. As a new nurse in a children's cancer center, I quickly learned how difficult this job could be. It wasn't the caring for the children, no. That was the part that kept me going. It was watching these innocent souls fight battles they didn't deserve, knowing the heartbreak that lay ahead. I worked with a boy named Adam, who was just 3 years old. His parents were warm and kind, and Adam, despite being terminally ill with blood cancer, had a smile that could light up a room. He'd play and laugh, oblivious to the gravity of his condition. I couldn't help but think of my own 3-year-old son at home, and how devastating it would be to lose him. But over time, Adam grew weaker. The cancer took its toll, and the treatments made him feel worse. Yet through it all, he continued to smile. He just wanted to watch cartoons. Then, one evening, while lying in his bed, his heart suddenly stopped. He passed away so peacefully, with his eyes closed, as if he had drifted into a deep, eternal sleep. His parents were understandably devastated, but they knew the inevitable was coming. That night, I came home at 7:45 p.m., just as my husband was leaving for work. My son was already asleep, so I took the time to shower and clear my mind. As I stood drying off, I noticed something strange, a set of 4 small fingers peeking underneath the bathroom door. I thought it was my son, so I called out to him, laughing. "Why are you still up, baby?" The fingers moved as if feeling around the base of the door. Curious, I finished drying off, wrapped my hair in a towel, and opened the door. To my surprise, no one was there. I called out for my son, but he didn't answer. I checked his room, and he was fast asleep, completely unaware of what had just happened. Still unsure of what I had seen, I went to the kitchen for some water, and then it hit me. I wasn't scared. I was just overwhelmed with emotion, wishing that Adam was finally free of his pain. After a few moments, I went back to my son's room, held him close, and fell asleep, hoping that Adam had found peace. Story #2. The Call from Beyond. Back in 2002, I worked in the ICU, where many patients passed away. One patient, Bob, was 84 years old and suffering from severe pneumonia. Despite all the life-saving measures, his condition worsened, and we all knew he wouldn't make it through the night. His son, Robert, had just lost his mother 3 months prior and couldn't bear the thought of losing his father too. I tried to reach him to let him know how critical Bob's condition had become, but he was unreachable. He had been drinking and couldn't come to the hospital. As Bob's heart slowed, I stayed with him, trying everything I could to keep him alive, per Robert's request. I called again, but received no response. At 2 a.m., when Bob's heart rate had plummeted, I stepped outside his room to make another attempt to contact Robert. When the phone rang, it went unanswered for several moments before someone finally picked up. "Hello, Robert, are you there?" I asked. But then, I heard something strange. An old, raspy voice whispered, "Let him go." Thinking it was a mistake, I tried calling again, but there was no response. That's when I saw Robert and his wife standing in the doorway, walking into Bob's room. I quickly ended the call, my heart racing. Robert had come just in time to say his goodbyes. After some moments of silence, he made the decision to withdraw care and within minutes, Bob passed away. But the eerie feeling remained. Later, I learned that Robert and his wife had no one else living with them. Yet, I still can't shake the feeling that it wasn't Robert who answered the phone that night. I believe it was his late mother, still lingering in their home, guiding him through the hardest decision of his life. Story #3, The Child in the Blue Dress. I worked in a nursing facility in Central California, once a children's hospital during the tuberculosis outbreak in the late 1800s. This place, with its haunting history, was a breeding ground for ghost stories. Many patients reported hearing children laughing at night, or seeing them jumping on the beds of unoccupied rooms. One night, while working the swing shift from 3 o'clock to 11 o'clock, I encountered a patient named Timmy. He was in his 50s, sent to our facility due to severe liver damage caused by alcoholism. Timmy was disoriented and confused from a high level of ammonia in his body. One evening, while giving him his medication, I struggled to get him to take it, but eventually he managed to drink it. Then, Timmy said something that sent chills down my spine. "Can I have another shot? For the little girl?" I was taken aback. "What little girl?" I asked. "The little girl in a blue dress," Timmy replied, his eyes glazed over. "She came in and talked to me earlier." I was confused, but I didn't think much of it at the time. A few days later, Timmy's condition worsened, and he passed away. I often wonder, was Timmy speaking to someone from another time? Or had he truly seen the spirit of a child still wandering the halls of the old hospital, now a nursing home? As I spent more time working at the facility, I began noticing strange occurrences. At night, I would occasionally hear the sound of children laughing. Sometimes, a dying patient would mention a little girl in a blue dress. They'd describe her in the same way. "There's a little girl in a blue dress who came and spoke with me last night, but I can't remember her name." And curiously, no one could remember her name. It seemed like a mysterious pattern. Some patients even mentioned feeling a sense of peace after speaking with her. Was she a spirit sent to comfort the dying? Or was there something darker at play? After 6 years of working there, I transferred to a psychiatric facility, but I couldn't shake the mystery of the little girl in the blue dress. I still wonder, did she guide them toward peace? Or was she ushering them away? Story 4. I'm an emergency room nurse, and one night, a man arrived via ambulance complaining of stabbing chest pain. He was about 4'11" and weighed around 300 pounds. His hygiene was poor, and there was a pungent odor around him, a mixture of vomit and feces, which made it hard to breathe. He told us he had been sitting on his couch, watching TV and peeling a mango. After eating it, he fell asleep. But when he woke up, he was in excruciating chest pain, short of breath. He immediately called 911, convinced the mango was the cause. We hooked him up to a monitor and found his cardiac rhythm was normal. An EKG confirmed it, and his blood pressure was high, so we administered a shot to bring it down. Despite this, his chest pain continued, and he described each breath as feeling like a stab in the chest. We drew his blood, and the results were normal too. Still, we weren't sure what was causing the pain, so the doctor ordered an MRI. We checked the patient thoroughly before bringing him to the MRI room. For those unfamiliar, MRI machines are huge magnets, and you can't bring any metal into the room. So we made sure he had no jewelry, piercings, or metal objects on him. But as we opened the MRI room door, something strange happened. A small knife with a yellow handle flew out from the patient's abdominal skin fold and straight toward the machine. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but it was clear that the knife had been causing his chest pain. I couldn't help but laugh. It was the last thing I'd expected after all the tests we'd done. The MRI was normal, but the knife, lodged between his skin folds, had been the source of the pain. Later, I learned that the patient had passed away from a hemorrhagic stroke, which was unrelated to the knife incident. That night, on my way home from work, I was feeling feverish and left early. When I got to my car in the garage, I noticed a strange smell. It was the same stench I remembered from the hospital. I thought nothing of it, assuming it was just a lingering odor from the elevators. But then, something hit my window. A green mango rolled across the floor. I looked around, but the garage was empty. As I backed out, another mango hit my window, coming from the direction of the elevator, but no one was there. I quickly drove home, unsettled. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but a part of me couldn't shake the thought that it was connected to the mango guy. Story 5. I've been a nurse for nearly 15 years and have seen my share of strange events, but there's one that still haunts me. It happened during a quiet night shift at a small rural nursing home, an old building from the early 1900s. The ward was eerily empty, with only a few patients scattered across the floor. I was the only nurse on duty, and it was one of those nights when the silence felt oppressive, almost suffocating. Around 2 a.m., I was making my rounds when I passed room 7. Suddenly, I felt a cold chill in the air, and despite the layers of my uniform, I shivered. Room 7 had been empty for several days. The last patient who had occupied it, Mr. Thompson, had passed away in his sleep 4 days earlier. I remembered him well. He was a sweet, elderly man who spent his last days in pain and confusion. I'd often see him in his rocking chair, whispering to someone invisible. As I walked past the room, I heard a rhythmic tapping sound. My heart pounded in my chest. It was coming from inside room 7. I hesitated, but then slowly pushed the door open. The room was dark, with only faint light coming through a small window. The bed was neatly made, just as it had been since Mr. Thompson passed, but my eyes were drawn to the rocking chair in the corner. It was rocking back and forth on its own. Frozen, I watched. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, but none came. The chair continued to rock as though someone was sitting there. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The room fell into a chilling silence. I took a step back, but then I heard a faint whisper. "I can't breathe." The voice was weak, frail, unmistakably Mr. Thompson's. My blood ran cold. He was gone, but there I was, hearing his voice as though he was still there. Was it a trick of my mind? Or was it his spirit, still lingering? I fled the room, my heart racing. At the nurse's station, I found one of the nursing assistants. She asked, "Did you hear that too?" I nodded, too shaken to speak. We sat in silence for the rest of the night, neither of us daring to go near room 7 again. The next morning, I told the incoming nurse about what happened, expecting her to brush it off. But to my surprise, she looked at me solemnly and said, "You're not the first to hear him. Mr. Thompson was always asking for help in his final days. Some part of him is still waiting for someone to answer." From that night on, I avoided room 7. I couldn't help but wonder if I had stayed, if I had tried to help him, would he have finally found peace? Or would I have become just another lost spirit in that old, forgotten room? Story 6. I was a new nurse working at a nursing home when I met the elderly couple in room 11. Mr. and Mrs. Clark had lived there for almost 3 years. I wasn't there when Mrs. Clark was sent to the hospital, but I later found out she passed away there. Mr. Clark had dementia, and I wasn't sure if he knew that his wife had died. Once I completed my orientation and started my regular shift, I worked the swing shift from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. One evening, while doing my rounds, I entered room 11 and found Mr. Clark sitting in his chair, looking out the window. His eyes were distant, his face expressionless, but there was something unsettling about the way he looked. His gaze seemed focused on something beyond the window, something I couldn't see. "Where's Mrs. Clark?" I asked gently, not expecting a response. But to my surprise, he turned toward me, his eyes wide, and said softly, "She's still here, sitting right next to me." I looked over to the empty chair beside him, but in that moment, I could have sworn I saw her just for a second. It could have been a trick of the light, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But when I looked back at Mr. Clark, he was smiling, as though content in the presence of someone I couldn't see. That moment stayed with me long after I left my shift. Sometimes, I wonder if Mr. Clark truly saw something, or if his mind was just trying to hold on to the memory of the woman he loved. The missing hearing aids. I had been working at the nursing home for about 6 months when the incident with Mr. Clark happened. One morning during breakfast, he suddenly began coughing violently. He couldn't catch his breath, gasping for air. The food had gone down the wrong pipe and ended up in his lungs. We rushed him to the hospital, and they hooked him up to a ventilator. But a few days later, Mr. Clark passed away. It was a tough loss for everyone. Shortly after his passing, Mr. Clark's daughter called. She said she would be coming the next morning to collect his belongings. Lori, the nursing assistant, was tasked with gathering his things. She had a list of his personal items and began checking his room. About 20 minutes later, Lori called me in. She said she couldn't find Mr. Clark's hearing aids. Everything else was accounted for, but those hearing aids were missing. I joined her to double-check. We searched the entire room, but came up empty. That's when I opened the nightstand and noticed something odd, a blue urn. I froze and asked Lori if the urn contained ashes. She responded nonchalantly, "Oh, that's Mrs. Clark." I hadn't known that Mrs. Clark had been cremated, or that her ashes were kept in the room with her husband. We continued searching, but never found the hearing aids. In the end, we packed everything up for Mr. Clark's daughter. The next night, around 10:45 p.m., I was at the nurse's station, preparing for the night shift. Suddenly, we heard noises coming from Mr. and Mrs. Clark's old room. It sounded like something or someone was slamming cabinets or banging against the walls. We went to investigate, but when we opened the door, there was nothing. The room was completely still. The following day, Mr. Clark's daughter arrived to collect the belongings. She was informed about the missing hearing aids, but she said, "Actually, my dad was wearing them when he was sent to the hospital. The staff there already gave them to me." That was a relief. Hearing aids are expensive after all. After that, the Clark's room was cleaned and prepared for new patients. But that night, around 9 o'clock, after we dimmed most of the hallway lights to let the patients sleep, the noises started again. Banging, cabinets slamming it, came from the same room. Lori, the CNA, went in and turned on the light. She muttered something under her breath. "Mrs. Clark, they found the hearing aids. Mary took them home." I was confused and asked Lori why she'd said that. She explained that Mr. Clark often misplaced his hearing aids, and Mrs. Clark would always get upset, yelling and slamming drawers in frustration while looking for them. I was shocked. It seemed as though Mrs. Clark's spirit had been helping her husband, even after death. After that, the disturbances stopped. I'm sure there are other staff members who have experienced similar occurrences over the years, and they know how to handle these situations. I, on the other hand, had never dealt with something like that before. The whispering in room 313 in my years as a nurse. I've witnessed many unexplainable things, but there's one experience that will forever haunt me. It happened during my 3rd year on the night shift at an old, creaky hospital in a small town. The building had a reputation for strange occurrences, though most of us dismissed the stories. That was until that night. It was around 2 a.m. when I was making my rounds. The floor was eerily quiet, and the only sound was my footsteps echoing down the hallway. I was assigned to the geriatric unit, which housed mostly elderly, nonverbal patients. The atmosphere was always heavy, but that night it felt suffocating. As I approached room 313, where Mrs. Owens had been bedridden for weeks, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. The room was darker than usual, colder too. Mrs. Owens, who had been unresponsive for as long as I had known her, lay in bed motionless, her face ashen and gaunt. But something was different this time. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. As I checked her monitors, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Mrs. Owens' eyes were wide open. Her eyes had never opened in all the time I had cared for her, but now they were staring straight ahead, unblinking, fixed on something I couldn't see. Then I heard a whisper. It was so faint, I almost thought I was imagining it. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the words, but they were too jumbled. And then Mrs. Owens' lips parted slightly, and in a rasping, breathless voice, she whispered, "He's here." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and the whispering intensified, growing louder, more distinct, until it sounded like dozens of voices speaking at once. But the words were still garbled, incomprehensible. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the whispering stopped. Mrs. Owens's eyes slowly closed again, and her face returned to its usual lifeless state. I stumbled out of the room, shaking, and told the other nurse on duty about what had just happened. She looked at me with a skeptical frown, brushing it off as exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. The next morning, I reported the incident to the day nurse. Her face went pale as she listened, and when I finished, she sighed. "Room 313 has a history," she said. "Over the years, several patients have passed away in that room, all under strange circumstances. Some nurses have reported seeing shadows moving in the corners or hearing whispers late at night. Mrs. Owens passed away later that week." Closing, that's all for this video. Thank you for sticking with me through these chilling stories. Have a wonderful day or night wherever you are.